The syringe slipped from Dr. Elena Rodriguez's trembling fingers, clattering against the sterile hospital floor as she stared at the lab results. The 7-year-old girl lying unconscious in bed 3 wasn't suffering from a diabetic episode. She was being systematically poisoned. The pediatric ICU erupted into chaos as nurses rushed toward the monitor's urgent beeping, their soft-soled shoes squeaking against linoleum, while alarms pierced the antiseptic air. In the hallway, an elderly woman clutched a worn photograph of a soldier, her arthritic hands shaking as she watched through the glass partition where her granddaughter fought for life. "Get me toxicology now!" Dr. Rodriguez barked into her phone, her mind racing between the impossible insulin readings and the German shepherd that had been howling outside the hospital for 3 straight hours. What kind of monster would poison a child? And how long had this been happening under their noses? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching. From now, let's continue with the story. Riverside County, California, had always been the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's business and children rode bicycles without fear. The desert community of 8,000 souls stretched across sun-baked hills dotted with Joshua trees and memories of better times when the Sterling Pharmaceuticals factory provided good jobs and the future seemed certain as Sunday service. Margaret Maggie Thompson had called this place home for 43 years, ever since she'd followed her young husband back from his first tour in Vietnam. Now, at 72, she moved through her modest ranch house with the careful deliberation of someone who'd learned that every day was borrowed time. The Purple Heart flag in her front window had faded from years of desert sun, but the pride behind it remained sharp as the day they'd folded another flag and handed it to her with military precision. Her hands, weathered by decades of nursing wounded soldiers and raising a son alone, trembled slightly as she arranged Sophie's medications on the kitchen counter. 7 bottles for a 7-year-old child seemed like an obscenity, but the doctors insisted each one was necessary. The little girl who'd come to live with her 6 months ago rarely spoke above a whisper, and some days not at all. Sophie's dark eyes held secrets that no child should carry, shadows that had settled there the night her parents died in what the authorities called a tragic accident on Highway 74. The house felt too quiet most mornings, filled with the ghost sounds of a family that had once thrived here. Tommy's high school football trophies still lined the mantelpiece, collecting dust beside Sophie's crayon drawings of dogs with oversized hearts and angel wings. Maggie couldn't bring herself to pack away her son's things, not when his daughter needed reminders that love had once lived loudly in these rooms. As Sophie appeared in the doorway wearing her favorite pink pajamas, the ones with puppies that Maggie had bought during their first shopping trip together. The child's face was pale, and she clutched her stomach with both hands in a gesture that had become frighteningly familiar. These episodes were getting worse, coming more frequently despite the careful medication schedule that governed their days. "Grandma Maggie," Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the air conditioning unit that fought a losing battle against the desert heat. "My tummy feels funny again." Maggie's trained eye caught the slight tremor in Sophie's hands, the way she favored her left side when she walked. These weren't normal childhood complaints. After 30 years as an Army trauma nurse, she recognized symptoms that the parade of doctors had somehow missed or dismissed. Something was wrong with her granddaughter, something beyond the trauma of losing parents, and every instinct she'd honed in emergency rooms and battlefield hospitals was screaming warnings that no one seemed willing to hear. The morning sun slanted through kitchen windows, casting long shadows across linoleum that had witnessed 3 generations of breakfast conversations. Today, like every day for the past 6 months, would begin with pills and prayers, hope and growing desperation. The Riverside County Animal Shelter sat on the outskirts of town like a forgotten promise, its chain-link runs baking under the relentless California sun. What had once been a hopeful facility with bright murals and volunteer gardens now bore the weathered look of a place where hope came to die. Budget cuts had reduced the staff to skeleton crews, and the no-kill sign at the entrance had been quietly removed 3 months ago, when the county commissioners decided that some problems were too expensive to solve with compassion. Maggie pulled her ancient Buick into the gravel parking lot, Sophie silent in the passenger seat with her sketchpad clutched against her chest. They'd come here on Dr. Patterson's suggestion after Sophie's latest episode had left her hospitalized for 2 days. Sometimes, the pediatrician had said with the practiced tone of someone who'd run out of medical explanations, children need therapeutic interaction with animals to process trauma. The shelter director, a tired woman named Carol Hendricks, met them at the reception desk with forms and warnings. "Most of our dogs are fine with children," she explained, glancing nervously toward the kennel area where occasional barking punctuated the desert silence. "But we do have one animal that's problematic. A German shepherd in isolation. He came from military surplus, and we can't place him. Board's voting next week on whether to—" She let the sentence hang unfinished, the way adults did when they thought children weren't listening. Sophie's head snapped up from her drawing, dark eyes suddenly alert. "What's his name?" "Well, sweetie, his paperwork just says Rex, but nobody's been able to get close enough to really work with him. He's been here 3 months, and we've had 7 incidents with staff. The liability insurance, I want to see him." Sophie's voice carried a certainty that made Maggie's breath catch. Her granddaughter rarely expressed preferences about anything, moving through life with the careful neutrality of someone who'd learned that wanting things was dangerous. Carol Hendricks exchanged a meaningful look with Maggie. "Ma'am, I don't think that's advisable. This particular animal has shown extreme aggression toward adults, and we have protocols." "Just to look," Maggie interrupted, recognizing something in Sophie's posture she hadn't seen since the funeral. "From a safe distance." The kennel area stretched down a concrete corridor lined with chain-link runs, most containing dogs that pressed against the fencing with hopeful eyes and wagging tails. The sound of their presence created a symphony of barks and whines that should have been joyful, but instead felt desperate. At the far end, separated from the other animals by an additional barrier and warning signs, sat the isolation unit. Rex occupied a reinforced run twice the size of the others, but he might as well have been caged in a coffin. The German shepherd lay in the farthest corner, massive head resting on his paws, amber eyes tracking their approach with the wary intelligence of a creature who'd learned that humans brought pain. His black and tan coat was pristine, well-muscled frame speaking to military conditioning, but something in his stillness suggested violence held in check by will alone. "Jesus, Mary, and Joseph," Maggie whispered, her nurse's eye catching details that others might miss. The dog's ears bore small scars consistent with explosive damage. His left front leg showed the telltale signs of surgical repair. This wasn't just an aggressive animal. This was a warrior who'd seen too much and trusted too little. Sophie approached the barrier without hesitation, her small hands wrapping around the chain link as she studied Rex with the intensity she usually reserved for her drawings. The shelter director tensed, ready to pull the child back, but something extraordinary happened. Rex lifted his head, ears pricking forward, and for the first time in 3 months, his tail moved in the slightest acknowledgement. "He's not mean," Sophie said softly, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. The other dogs had stopped barking, as if sensing something significant in this moment. "He's just scared like me." Maggie felt her heart stutter. These were the first words Sophie had spoken above a whisper since arriving at her house 6 months ago. The child who communicated primarily through drawings and nods was suddenly articulate, present in a way that dozens of therapy sessions hadn't achieved. Rex rose slowly, his movements deliberate and controlled, and walked to the front of his enclosure. He sat precisely 6 feet from where Sophie stood, maintaining distance but offering engagement. His amber eyes never left the little girl's face, and in that gaze, Maggie recognized something she'd seen in the faces of soldiers returning from war, the careful assessment of someone deciding whether to trust. "Sophie, honey, we should probably—" Carol began, but the child was already reaching into her backpack. She pulled out her latest drawing, one Maggie had watched her work on obsessively for days. It showed a large dog with detailed markings identical to Rex's, standing guard over a small figure with dark hair. At the top of the page, in Sophie's careful printing, were the words, "Brave dog keeps little girls safe." Sophie held the drawing against the chain link, and Rex tilted his head, studying the image with apparent comprehension. Then he did something that made Carol Hendricks gasp and Maggie's eyes fill with tears. The massive German shepherd lowered himself to the ground, placed his muzzle near the fence where Sophie's paper rested, and released a soft whine that sounded less like animal communication and more like conversation. "Well, I'll be damned," came a gravelly voice behind them. They turned to see an elderly man in a veteran's cap approaching, his gait unsteady but determined. "Haven't seen Rex respond to anyone like that since he got here." Dr. James Crawford introduced himself as a retired military veterinarian who volunteered at the shelter, trying to help animals that conventional medicine had written off. His weathered face creased with interest as he observed the interaction between child and dog. "That animal's got more trauma than most soldiers I've treated," he explained quietly to Maggie while Sophie continued her silent communication with Rex. "Served 3 tours overseas with a handler who died in his arms. Witnessed things that would break most people's minds. But look at him now." Indeed, Rex's entire demeanor had transformed. The coiled tension that had defined his shelter existence had eased into something approaching peace. His breathing had slowed, his ears were forward in a posture of attention rather than aggression, and his tail continued its subtle movement. "Sophie," Maggie called gently, "we should let Dr. Crawford do his work." But as they prepared to leave, Sophie turned back to Rex with a solemnity that seemed ancient in her young face. "I'll come back tomorrow," she promised, "and I'll bring more pictures." Rex's response was immediate and unmistakable. He moved to the front of his enclosure and placed his paw against the chain link where Sophie's hand rested on the other side. For a moment, separated by metal and circumstances but connected by something deeper than either species typically acknowledged, a damaged dog and a traumatized child found recognition in each other's eyes. The drive home passed in unusual silence, but it was a different quality of quiet than Maggie had grown accustomed to. This felt less like absence and more like anticipation. The transformation began the next morning when Sophie woke before dawn, something she hadn't done since arriving at Maggie's house. She padded into the kitchen where her grandmother was already brewing coffee, the familiar ritual that had anchored their days together for 6 months. "Can we go see Rex today?" Sophie asked, her voice clearer than Maggie had heard it since the funeral. "I promised him." Maggie studied her granddaughter's face, noting the spark of purpose that had replaced the hollow distance she'd grown accustomed to. "After your medicine and breakfast, sweetheart, Dr. Crawford said he'd be there this morning." The mention of medication brought a shadow across Sophie's features. The daily regimen of pills had become a source of increasing resistance, with Sophie claiming they made her feel cloudy and far away. Maggie had raised concerns with Dr. Patterson, but he'd insisted the prescriptions were necessary for managing what he termed complicated grief response with somatic manifestations. At the shelter, Dr. Crawford was waiting with news that sent ripples through Maggie's understanding of their situation. "I've been reviewing Rex's military records," he explained as they walked toward the kennel area. His handler was a young man named Thomas Thompson, stationed out of Camp Lejeune. Ring any bells? Maggie's coffee cup slipped from her fingers, shattering against the concrete floor in a spray of ceramic and dark liquid. "Tommy?" she whispered, the name catching in her throat like a prayer. "That's my son's name. Thomas Thompson. But he's been deployed for 8 months. His unit said—" "Ma'am." Dr. Crawford's voice carried the careful tone of someone delivering news that would change everything. "According to these records, Sergeant Thompson was killed 6 months ago." Rex was the only survivor of an incident that's still classified, but the paperwork shows he was shipped stateside for medical evaluation and eventual retirement. The timeline struck Maggie like a physical blow. 6 months ago was when Sophie's parents had died, when the little girl had come to live with her, when their carefully constructed life had begun its slow spiral into medical mysteries and mounting expenses. The coincidence felt too significant to dismiss, yet too impossible to accept. Sophie, who had been listening with the intense focus she usually reserved for her artwork, suddenly spoke up. Rex was Daddy's dog? Before either adult could respond, a commotion erupted from the kennel area. Rex was barking with an urgency they hadn't heard before, a sharp, repetitive pattern that Dr. Crawford immediately recognized as a trained alert signal. They rushed toward his enclosure to find the German Shepherd pressed against the chain link, his entire body rigid with tension as he stared toward the parking lot. Through the shelter's front windows, they could see a sleek black sedan pulling up to the entrance. The woman who emerged was striking in the way that money and careful maintenance could make anyone appear. Perfectly styled silver hair, designer clothes that managed to look both expensive and practical, and the confident bearing of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. "That's Victoria Sterling," Carol Hendricks said, appearing beside them with obvious anxiety. "She's on the county board that oversees our funding. She's also—" Carol hesitated, glancing at Sophie. "She's been very vocal about the need for stricter policies regarding aggressive animals." Rex's barking intensified, taking on a quality that made the hair on Maggie's arms stand up. This wasn't the sound of a dog seeing a stranger. This was the sound of a trained military animal identifying a threat. Other dogs in the facility began responding to his distress, creating a cacophony that filled the concrete corridors with urgent warnings. Victoria Sterling entered the shelter with the smooth authority of someone used to having doors opened and problems solved. She was younger than Maggie had expected, perhaps in her early 50s, with the kind of polished appearance that spoke of boardrooms and charity galas. Her smile was warm and practiced as she approached their group, but Maggie noticed that her eyes remained cool, calculating. "Ms. Thompson, isn't it?" Victoria's voice carried a slight accent that suggested East Coast education and careful cultivation. "I'm Victoria Sterling. I've heard about your granddaughter's, situation, and I wanted to offer my assistance." The way she said "situation" made Maggie's nurse instincts prickle with warning. There was something in Victoria's tone that suggested she knew more about their circumstances than a stranger should, something that implied familiarity with private details that hadn't been shared publicly. "I'm not sure what you mean," Maggie replied carefully, instinctively moving closer to Sophie, who had gone very still beside her. "The medical expenses, of course," Victoria continued smoothly. "Childhood diabetes is such a challenging diagnosis, especially for families on fixed incomes. Sterling Pharmaceuticals has a robust assistance program for qualifying families. We could ensure Sophie receives the very best care with the very best doctors, using the most advanced treatments available." Maggie felt the world tilt slightly off its axis. "I'm sorry, but Sophie hasn't been diagnosed with diabetes. Dr. Patterson is still running tests to determine what's causing her episodes." Victoria's smile never wavered, but something shifted behind her eyes. "Oh, my mistake. I must have misunderstood the reports. You know how small towns are with medical gossip." She turned her attention to Sophie, who had pressed closer to Maggie's side. "Hello, sweetheart. I've heard you've been feeling poorly. How would you like to see some very special doctors who might be able to help you feel all better?" Sophie's response was immediate and unmistakable. She shrank back as if Victoria's words were physical threats, her small hand clutching Maggie's with surprising strength. "No," she whispered, the word barely audible but carrying absolute conviction. "I don't want to." Rex's barking reached a crescendo that forced everyone to cover their ears. The German shepherd was throwing himself against his enclosure with a violence that made the chain link shudder, his amber eyes fixed on Victoria with unmistakable hostility. Foam flecked his muzzle as he continued his assault on the barrier that separated him from the woman, and for the first time since meeting him, Maggie understood why people called him dangerous. "Goodness," Victoria said, stepping back with what appeared to be genuine alarm. "That animal is clearly unstable. Carol, I thought we'd discuss the liability issues of keeping aggressive animals in a facility that allows public access, especially children." Dr. Crawford had moved to Rex's enclosure, speaking in low, urgent tones that seemed to have some calming effect on the agitated dog. "Rex, stand down. Easy, boy. Easy." His weathered hands remained steady on the chain link despite the dog's continued aggression, and gradually Rex's barking subsided to a low, continuous growl. "Dr. Crawford," Victoria continued, her voice taking on the authoritative tone of someone accustomed to giving orders. "As a board member, I'm concerned about the protocols here. This animal has already demonstrated violent tendencies, and now we have children present during what appears to be a psychotic episode." "Ma'am, with respect," Dr. Crawford replied, his own voice hardening. "Rex is a decorated military working dog with 3 tours of service. He's trained to identify threats, and his behavior suggests he's responding to a specific stimulus, not having a psychotic episode." The implication hung in the air between them like smoke from a gun that had already been fired. Victoria's composure cracked just slightly, enough for Maggie to catch a glimpse of something cold and calculating beneath the polished exterior. "I think we should go," Maggie said suddenly, her protective instincts overriding her curiosity about Victoria's strange knowledge of Sophie's condition. Sophie's had enough excitement for one day. But as they prepared to leave, Sophie did something that stopped everyone in their tracks. She walked directly to Rex's enclosure, placed her small hand against the chain link, and looked straight at Victoria Sterling. "The flower lady," Sophie said clearly, her voice carrying in the sudden silence. "Rex knows about the flower lady." Victoria's face went completely white. "I'm sorry. What did she say?" "Sophie, honey, what do you mean by flower lady?" Maggie asked gently, kneeling beside her granddaughter. "The lady who brought flowers to Mommy and Daddy," Sophie continued, her dark eyes never leaving Victoria's face. "Before they went to sleep forever. She smelled like the flowers that make you sleepy." Dr. Crawford's sharp intake of breath was audible in the quiet that followed. Rex had stopped growling entirely, now sitting at attention as if waiting for orders, his gaze shifting between Sophie and Victoria with the intensity of a soldier awaiting commands. "I think," Victoria said carefully, her polished composure returning like armor sliding back into place, "there may be some confusion here. I've never met this child before today." But her hands were shaking as she gathered her purse, and Maggie noticed that she was backing toward the exit with the careful movements of someone trying not to trigger a predator's chase instinct. The pieces of a puzzle Maggie hadn't known existed began shifting in her mind, forming patterns that made her blood run cold. That night, Maggie sat at her kitchen table surrounded by boxes she hadn't opened since Tommy's funeral. The official military notification had been brief and sanitized. Sergeant Thomas Thompson, killed in action during a classified operation, posthumous Purple Heart, closed casket service. She'd accepted it because questioning the military was like questioning gravity, pointless and painful. But now, with Dr. Crawford's revelation echoing in her mind and Sophie's strange recognition of Victoria Sterling, Maggie found herself pulling out documents she'd been too grief-stricken to examine carefully. Tommy's last letters home, his deployment records, the sparse personal effects that had been returned to her in a cardboard box marked with military efficiency. Sophie padded into the kitchen in her pajamas, carrying her sketchbook and the small stuffed dog she'd slept with since arriving. "Grandma Maggie, I can't sleep. My tummy feels funny again." Maggie set aside a bundle of Tommy's letters and felt Sophie's forehead. No fever, but the child's skin felt clammy and her pupils were slightly dilated. These episodes were becoming more frequent, more severe, despite the medication regimen Dr. Patterson had prescribed. "Let's check your levels, sweetheart," Maggie said, reaching for the glucose monitor that had become as much a part of their routine as brushing teeth. The reading made her breath catch. 45 mg DL, dangerously low for a child Sophie's age. As Maggie prepared orange juice and crackers, Sophie opened her sketchbook to a fresh page and began drawing with the focused intensity that had become her primary form of communication. This drawing was different from her usual dogs with angel wings. This one showed a woman with flowing hair standing beside a car, holding what looked like flowers. In the background, two figures lay still on what appeared to be a road. "Sophie, honey, is this about your mommy and daddy?" Maggie asked gently, settling beside her granddaughter with the juice. Sophie nodded, her small hand moving the crayon with deliberate precision. "The flower lady came to the car when it wouldn't move anymore. She said she was helping, but the flowers made mommy and daddy sleep, and they wouldn't wake up." Maggie's hands stilled on the glucose monitor. Car accident was the official cause of death, a late-night collision on a desert highway with no witnesses. Sophie had been found 12 hours later, dehydrated and traumatized but physically unharmed, with no memory of how she'd survived or why she'd been discovered nearly a mile from the crash site. "What kind of flowers, sweetheart?" "White ones. They smelled sweet, but wrong, like medicine." Sophie's crayon pressed harder against the paper, adding dark shadows around the woman's figure. "Rex knows about the flower lady. That's why he was so mad today." The pieces clicked together in Maggie's mind with the terrible logic of a nurse who'd seen too much violence disguised as accident. Certain flowers, when processed correctly, could produce compounds that would render someone unconscious quickly. A staged accident. A sole survivor too young to provide coherent testimony. A pharmaceutical executive with access to the kind of chemicals that wouldn't show up in routine toxicology screens. Maggie's phone rang, startling them both. Dr. Crawford's gravelly voice carried urgency even through the static of poor reception. "Maggie, I need you to listen carefully. I've been making some calls about Rex's service record, and I've learned some things that change everything." "Is Sophie there with you?" "Yes, she's right here." "What's wrong?" "Tommy didn't die in Afghanistan. He was stateside, investigating discrepancies in military pharmaceutical contracts. Someone killed him to stop his investigation, and Rex was there when it happened. The dog's been protecting Sophie because he recognizes her as Tommy's family." Maggie sank into her chair, the room spinning slightly as implications crashed over her like waves. "Dr. Crawford, Sophie just told me something about a woman with flowers at her parents' accident scene. A woman who matches Victoria Sterling's description." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Maggie thought the call had dropped. When Dr. Crawford spoke again, his voice carried the weight of terrible understanding. "Maggie, you need to get Sophie out of that house. Tonight, Victoria Sterling lost her own son 15 years ago to contaminated insulin from a military contract. If she's been targeting military families for revenge, if she killed Tommy and Sophie's parents, then Sophie isn't safe. That medication, doctor? Patterson prescribed. Where did it come from? Maggie's blood turned to ice as she looked at the neat row of prescription bottles on her counter. Each label bore the Sterling Pharmaceuticals logo. Each prescription filled at the pharmacy that held the exclusive contract for county medical services. Oh my God, she's been poisoning Sophie slowly. Get out, now. Bring the medications as evidence, but don't let Sophie take another dose. I'm calling Sheriff Martinez, but I don't know how far this conspiracy reaches. Take Rex with you. He's the only one who can identify Victoria as a threat, and he's the only living witness to what happened to Tommy. As if summoned by his name, the sound of Rex's howling drifted across the desert air from the direction of the animal shelter. But this wasn't his usual territorial vocalization. This was the sound of an animal in distress, urgent and desperate. Maggie grabbed her keys and Sophie's hand. We're going for a drive, sweetheart. Bring your pictures. The drive to the shelter took 8 minutes that felt like hours. Maggie's ancient Buick protested the speed she demanded from it, but her urgency grew with each passing second. Rex's howling had stopped, and the silence felt more ominous than the noise had been. The shelter parking lot was empty except for Dr. Crawford's truck and another vehicle that made Maggie's stomach clench with recognition. Victoria Sterling's black sedan parked in the shadows beyond the security lights. Stay in the car, Sophie. Lock the doors and don't open them for anyone except me or Dr. Crawford. What about Rex? Sophie's voice was small but determined. He's in trouble. I can feel it. Inside the shelter, emergency lighting cast harsh shadows down the corridor toward the kennel area. Maggie found Dr. Crawford unconscious near Rex's enclosure, a small dart protruding from his neck. The smell of veterinary sedatives hung heavy in the air, and Rex's kennel stood open, empty. Looking for your dog? Victoria Sterling stepped out of the shadows, no longer bothering with her polished facade. Her designer clothes were rumpled, her hair disheveled, and her eyes held the flat brightness of someone who'd crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed. Don't worry, he's just sleeping. Amazing what a concentrated dose of veterinary anesthesia can accomplish. Where is he? Maggie demanded, positioning herself between Victoria and the exit. What have you done? What I should have done months ago, Victoria replied, her voice carrying the calm certainty of someone who'd moved beyond the reach of normal human constraints. That animal is a walking liability, a witness to things that should stay buried, just like your precious granddaughter. Sophie hasn't done anything to you. Victoria's laugh held no humor. She's Tommy Thompson's daughter, which makes her a symbol of everything that destroyed my life. Do you know what it's like to hold your child while he dies from contaminated insulin? To watch pharmaceutical executives cover up their negligence with lawyers and payoffs? Your son cost me my boy, and now his daughter will pay that debt. The truth hit Maggie like a physical blow. You've been killing children, military children. Justice, Victoria corrected. 15 families have learned what I learned. 15 mothers have buried babies because of the corruption your son tried to expose. But he was too naive to understand that some problems can't be solved with reports and proper channels. You murdered my son. I eliminated a threat to carefully balanced scales. Tommy was going to destroy the perfect system I'd created. Controlled contamination that looked like natural variation in medication effectiveness. No one suspected intentional poisoning when death rates stayed within statistical norms. Dr. Crawford stirred on the concrete floor, groaning as consciousness returned. Victoria glanced at him with irritation, then back at Maggie. The old veterinarian will live, but Rex won't be so fortunate. Neither will Sophie unless you're willing to make a trade. What kind of trade? You take the blame for Rex's aggression. You tell authorities that you brought Sophie here against advice, that the dog attacked her, that you were forced to put him down in self-defense. In return, Sophie lives, though she'll continue her medication regimen until natural causes claim her in a few months. Maggie's nurse training kicked in, calculating dosages and timelines. The insulin you've been giving her, how long does she have? If she continues taking it, perhaps 2 weeks before irreversible organ damage. If she stops, Victoria shrugged. The withdrawal symptoms will be unpleasant, but not fatal. Your choice. You're insane. I'm thorough. 15 years of careful planning, systematic elimination of threats, controlled distribution of justice. Your granddaughter is the last name on my list. After her, I'll have balance again. A sound from the parking lot made them both freeze, the distinctive beep of a car door unlocking. Sophie had apparently decided that rules applied less than loyalty because her small voice carried clearly through the night air. Rex? Rex, where are you? Victoria's composure cracked completely. That child should be unconscious by now. The medication I switched in your kitchen should have... I stopped giving her your poison 3 hours ago. Maggie lied smoothly, buying time while her mind raced through options. Dr. Crawford warned me just in time. Then she'll have to join Rex immediately. Victoria reached into her purse and withdrew a syringe filled with clear liquid. Concentrated insulin, immediate and relatively painless, though the coma will be irreversible. "Sophie, run!" Maggie shouted as loudly as her lungs allowed. But instead of running, Sophie appeared in the doorway to the kennel area, and she wasn't alone. Limping heavily on sedated legs but moving with grim determination, Rex emerged from the shadows behind her. The German shepherd's amber eyes were dilated from drugs, but his training and protective instincts had overcome chemical suppression. "Down!" Sophie commanded, using the crisp tone she'd learned from watching Dr. Crawford work with Rex. Rex dropped immediately, positioning himself between Sophie and Victoria with military precision despite his compromised condition. Victoria raised the syringe, backing toward the rear exit. That animal is barely conscious. He can't protect anyone in his condition. "You're wrong," Dr. Crawford said, pulling himself upright against Rex's kennel. His voice was slurred but determined. Rex spent 3 tours protecting soldiers. A little veterinary sedative isn't going to stop him from protecting Tommy's daughter." "Tommy's daughter," Sophie repeated clearly, her voice carrying new understanding. "Daddy was my daddy. The real daddy, not the people who died in the car." Maggie's world tilted on its axis. "Sophie, what are you saying? The pictures in your room, the baby pictures? That's me, isn't it, Grandma Maggie? Daddy was my daddy, and you're not my grandma. You're my mama." The truth that Maggie had buried for 8 years rose like a tide she could no longer hold back. The young love affair with her childhood sweetheart before he shipped out to Vietnam. The pregnancy she'd hidden from everyone except her sister. The baby she'd given up for adoption to a military family who'd promised to love her as their own. The decades of wondering if she'd made the right choice. "Oh, sweetheart," Maggie whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry." "I'm so sorry I gave you away." Victoria used their emotional reunion to edge closer to the exit, but Rex's alert had brought unexpected backup. Sheriff Martinez appeared in the doorway behind her, service weapon drawn, flanked by 2 deputies and what appeared to be federal agents. "Victoria Sterling, you're under arrest for the murders of Sergeant Thomas Thompson, Mark and Linda Peterson, and conspiracy in the deaths of 14 other victims." "You can't prove anything," Victoria said, but her voice had lost its certainty. "Actually, we can." Dr. Crawford held up a small recording device. "This conversation, combined with Rex's trained identification of you as a threat and Sophie's eyewitness testimony, provides more than enough evidence." As the federal agents handcuffed Victoria Sterling, She looked directly at Sophie with eyes that held no remorse. "Your father should have minded his own business, little girl." "Some secrets are too big for heroes." "Daddy was brave," Sophie replied with quiet dignity. "And Rex is brave, and Mama Maggie is brave. That's why you lost." Later, as dawn broke over the desert and the last of the law enforcement vehicles departed, Maggie sat in the shelter's office with Sophie curled in her lap and Rex sleeping peacefully at their feet. The German shepherd's drug test would show he'd been given enough sedative to incapacitate a horse, but his loyalty to Sophie had literally overcome chemistry. "Mama Maggie," Sophie said softly, "can we take Rex home now? I think he's earned his rest." Maggie looked down at her daughter, not granddaughter, daughter, and felt pieces of her broken heart beginning to fuse back together. "Yes, sweetheart. I think it's time we all went home." The emergency board meeting convened at 6 a.m. in the Riverside County Municipal Building, called by Sheriff Martinez after Victoria Sterling's arrest had sent shockwaves through the small community. Word traveled fast in a town of 8,000, and by sunrise, protesters had gathered outside demanding answers about how a pharmaceutical executive had poisoned children for 15 years without detection. Maggie sat in the front row of the packed auditorium, Sophie beside her and Rex at their feet. The German shepherd wore a service dog vest that Dr. Crawford had hastily procured, making his presence legal in the public building. His amber eyes tracked every movement in the crowded room with the vigilance of a soldier still on duty, though the previous night's sedatives had left him moving more slowly than usual. County Commissioner Robert Hayes called the meeting to order with the grim efficiency of a man who'd spent 3 sleepless hours on conference calls with state and federal authorities. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're here to address the criminal conspiracy that has operated within our community for the past 15 years. I want to be clear from the outset. This investigation is ongoing, and not all information can be shared publicly at this time." The auditorium erupted in angry voices. Mary Hendricks, whose grandson had died of complications from juvenile diabetes 2 years earlier, stood near the back of the room with tears streaming down her face. "My Billy was perfectly healthy until he started school here. The doctors said his insulin just wasn't working properly. They said it happens sometimes." "How many children?" demanded Pastor William Hayes from the third row. "How many families have been destroyed while we trusted a system that was killing our babies?" Commissioner Hayes consulted a folder that trembled slightly in his weathered hands. "Federal investigators have identified 14 confirmed victims across 5 states over the past 15 years. All were children from military families. All died from what appeared to be natural complications of diabetes management." The number hit the assembled crowd like a physical blow. 14 children, 14 families destroyed by a conspiracy so methodical, so carefully disguised as medical misfortune, that it had operated undetected for over a decade. Dr. Elena Rodriguez, the pediatric endocrinologist who had first discovered Sophie's insulin poisoning, took the microphone with hands that visibly shook. "I want everyone in this room to understand what we're dealing with. Victoria Sterling didn't just contaminate medication randomly. She specifically targeted insulin supplies going to military families, introducing compounds that would cause gradual organ failure while appearing to be medication ineffectiveness." "What kind of person does that to children?" called out Janet Morrison, a mother of 3 whose husband had served 2 tours in Iraq. The answer came from an unexpected source. Sophie stood up from her seat, her small voice carrying clearly in the suddenly quiet auditorium. "A person whose heart got broken and then got angry instead of sad." All eyes turned to the 7-year-old who had become the focal point of this tragedy. Maggie started to pull her daughter back down, but Sophie gently resisted. "Mrs. Sterling lost her little boy," Sophie continued with the startling clarity that had become her trademark since the truth emerged. But instead of helping other little boys and girls so it wouldn't happen again, she decided to hurt them. Rex knows the difference between protecting people and hurting people. Mrs. Sterling forgot the difference. Rex lifted his head at the mention of his name, his tail moving slightly in acknowledgement. Several people in the audience began crying openly, the simple wisdom of a child cutting through their anger to expose the raw grief beneath. Dr. Crawford, sporting bandages from his encounter with Victoria's sedative dart, approached the microphone with obvious difficulty. "I want to address the elephant in the room," he said, his voice still slightly slurred from the drugs. "Rex has been characterized as a dangerous animal, but last night he overcame enough chemical sedation to kill a horse because he recognized that Sophie was in danger. This dog has saved more lives than most humans ever will." "That animal attacked 3 officers last week," countered Officer Bradley Chen, whose arm bore fresh bandages from one of Rex's incidents. "My injury report shows—" "Your injury report," Dr. Crawford interrupted with uncharacteristic heat, "shows that Rex attacked when you attempted to approach Sophie during one of her medical episodes. He was protecting a child who was being systematically poisoned, using skills he learned protecting soldiers in Afghanistan. If we're going to discuss dangerous behavior, let's discuss the humans who ignored a trained war dog's repeated warnings that something was wrong." The crowd murmured with growing understanding. How many of Rex's aggressive incidents had actually been attempts to protect children from contaminated medication? How many times had the dog tried to communicate a danger that adults were too blinded by protocol to recognize? Sheriff Martinez took the microphone, his badge catching the fluorescent lights as he faced the community he'd served for 23 years. "I need to address some hard truths about this investigation. Victoria Sterling didn't operate alone. So we've identified at least 3 accomplices within our medical and pharmaceutical distribution network. Dr. Patterson, who prescribed Sophie's contaminated insulin, has been taken into custody for questioning." Maggie felt the blood drain from her face. Dr. Patterson had been Sophie's primary physician, the man she'd trusted with her daughter's life. The scope of the conspiracy was expanding beyond her ability to process. "What about the other children?" asked Susan Martinez, the sheriff's wife and a retired school nurse. "The ones who are currently on Sterling Pharmaceuticals medications?" "All families with children on insulin therapy are being contacted immediately," Dr. Rodriguez responded. "We're establishing emergency treatment protocols using medications from verified, uncontaminated sources. No child will go without proper treatment while we sort this out." "And what about Rex?" called out Carol Hendricks from the shelter. "The county board voted last month to euthanize him. Are we seriously going to kill a dog who's been trying to save children's lives?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Commissioner Hayes shuffled through his papers with obvious discomfort. "The county's liability insurance requires that animals with documented aggressive incidents be—" "Bullshit," interrupted a gravelly voice from the back of the room. The speaker was a man Maggie didn't recognize, wearing a Vietnam veteran's cap and leaning heavily on a cane. "I served with that dog's handler in Afghanistan. Rex has more combat decorations than most soldiers. If we're putting down heroes because bureaucrats don't understand military training, then this country has lost its damn mind." A chorus of agreement rose from the veteran community scattered throughout the auditorium. These were men and women who understood the bonds between soldiers and their working animals, who recognized courage when they saw it regardless of species. Sophie tugged on Maggie's sleeve, requesting permission to speak again. When Maggie nodded, her daughter stood with the composure of someone far older than 7 years. "Rex isn't mean," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the packed room. "He's just trying to do his job. His job is keeping people safe, especially kids. He kept me safe when the grown-ups couldn't figure out that someone was making me sick." Maybe instead of being scared of him, we should listen to him. The wisdom of her words settled over the crowd like a blessing. How many other children might be alive if adults had paid attention to Rex's warnings? How many families might have been spared the agony of losing children to what they believed was medical misfortune? Pastor Hayes rose from his seat with the deliberate dignity of a man accustomed to speaking truth to power. I've been ministering to grieving families in this community for 37 years. I've held crying mothers who blamed themselves for their children's deaths, fathers who wondered if they'd somehow failed to get proper medical care. Now we learn that these families were targeted for murder because they wore our nation's uniform. His voice grew stronger as he continued, decades of pastoral authority flowing through his words. Rex didn't fail us. We failed Rex. We failed our children. We failed ourselves by trusting systems instead of instincts, protocols instead of protection. Commissioner Hayes called for order as the crowd grew increasingly agitated. But the mood had shifted beyond his control. This wasn't just about one dog anymore. It was about trust, justice, and the responsibility of a community to protect its most vulnerable members. "I move for an immediate vote," called out veteran James Murphy from the middle section. "All in favor of recognizing Rex as a hero rather than a threat, say aye." The response was thunderous, a roar of approval that shook the windows of the municipal building. Only a handful of voices opposed the motion, mostly county officials worried about liability and insurance policies. Dr. Crawford approached the microphone one final time, Rex limping slowly beside him as the crowd fell silent. "Rex has given everything for this community. He served 3 tours protecting soldiers, survived an assassination attempt that killed his handler, endured months of abuse and misunderstanding, and still risked his life to save a child who needed him." He paused, his weathered hand resting gently on Rex's head. "The question isn't whether Rex deserves our protection. The question is whether we deserve his loyalty." The answer came not in words but in sustained applause that continued for nearly 5 minutes. As the crowd gradually settled, Commissioner Hayes formally announced that all charges against Rex would be dropped. His status changed from dangerous animal to community service dog, and his adoption by the Thompson family officially approved. But perhaps the most significant moment came when Sophie stood once more and addressed the room with the clarity that had become her trademark since finding her voice again. "Mrs. Sterling thought she could make the hurt stop by hurting other people," she said, her small hand resting on Rex's neck. "But that's not how hurt works. Hurt stops when someone loves you enough to help you heal. Rex taught me that. Mama Maggie taught me that. Sometimes the best families aren't the ones you're born into, but the ones that choose to love you when you need it most." As the meeting adjourned and families began filing out to face an uncertain future, Maggie sat quietly with her daughter and their dog, watching the morning sun stream through the tall windows of the municipal building. The road ahead would be difficult. There would be trials, media attention, and the long process of healing for a community that had been betrayed by those it trusted most. But for the first time since Tommy's death, Maggie felt something that had been missing from her life for years. Hope. Not the desperate hope of someone clinging to impossible dreams, but the steady hope of someone who had witnessed love triumph over evil, who had seen courage emerge from the most unexpected places. Rex dozed peacefully at their feet, finally able to rest knowing his mission was complete. He had protected the child, exposed the threat, and found his way home to a family that understood his worth. Outside, protesters were beginning to disperse, but their voices carried promises of vigilance, demands for justice, and commitments to never again ignore the warnings of those trained to recognize danger. The community of Riverside County would be forever changed by the events of these past months, scarred by betrayal but strengthened by the knowledge that even in humanity's darkest moments, love could still prevail. 3 weeks after Victoria Sterling's arrest, the first tragedy struck with the cruel precision of a sniper's bullet. Dr. Elena Rodriguez called Maggie at 2:17 a.m., her voice tight with professional control, barely containing personal devastation. "Maggie, I need you to come to the hospital immediately. Bring Sophie. We've lost another child." The drive through empty desert roads felt like traveling through a nightmare landscape where familiar landmarks had been replaced by shadows and doubt. Sophie sat silent in the passenger seat, Rex alert and anxious in the back, all three of them sensing that their fragile victory was about to crumble. At Riverside County Memorial, the pediatric ward buzzed with activity that spoke of crisis management and controlled panic. Dr. Rodriguez met them at the nurses' station, her usually immaculate appearance disheveled by exhaustion and grief. "It's the Martinez boy, Carlos, 7 years old, diagnosed with type 1 diabetes 6 months ago. His family followed all our new protocols, switched to verified insulin sources, maintained perfect glucose logs, but something went wrong during the night." Maggie felt the familiar weight of professional knowledge settling over her like armor she didn't want to wear. What were his symptoms? Severe hypoglycemic shock, unresponsive to glucose administration. By the time the paramedics arrived, he'd been down too long. Brain death was declared an hour ago. The words hit Sophie like physical blows. She swayed against Maggie's side, her small face draining of color as the implications sank in. "But we stopped, Mrs. Sterling. We stopped the bad medicine." "We stopped Victoria," Dr. Rodriguez corrected gently. "But the damage she caused runs deeper than we initially understood. Some children have been exposed to contaminated insulin for years. Their body's ability to process glucose normally may be permanently compromised." Down the hall, Maria Martinez sat in a plastic chair that had witnessed too many moments of devastating news, her husband's arms wrapped around her shaking shoulders. Their son's death represented every parent's worst nightmare, doing everything right and still losing the battle that mattered most. Rex whined softly, sensing the grief that permeated the hospital corridors like smoke from an unseen fire. His training had taught him to detect threats, but this enemy was invisible, embedded in damaged metabolisms and compromised immune systems that might claim more victims despite their best efforts. "How many others?" Maggie asked, though she dreaded the answer. "We don't know yet. Dr. Chen is running comprehensive metabolic panels on every child who received Sterling insulin over the past 5 years. The preliminary results suggest that at least 12 children in our county alone may have sustained permanent damage." The magnitude of Victoria Sterling's revenge became clearer with each revelation. She hadn't simply murdered children. She'd created a medical time bomb that would continue claiming lives long after her arrest. Even stopped, her conspiracy would keep killing, a legacy of calculated evil that might span decades. Sophie tugged on Maggie's sleeve with the urgent persistence of a child who understood more than adults gave her credit for. "Mama Maggie, Rex is trying to tell us something." The German Shepherd had moved to the window overlooking the hospital parking lot, his body rigid with attention as he tracked something beyond their view. His low growl carried a warning that made the hair on Maggie's arms stand up with recognition. "Dr. Rodriguez, has anyone been asking questions about our new protocols? Anyone showing unusual interest in which children are being tested?" Before the doctor could answer, commotion erupted from the emergency department. Security guards rushed past their location toward the main entrance, radios crackling with urgent communications about an unauthorized person attempting to access patient records. Through the window, they could see sheriff's deputies surrounding a figure in the parking lot. Even at this distance, Maggie recognized the defiant posture and expensive clothing that marked Victoria Sterling's accomplice, Dr. Patterson, apparently attempting to continue the conspiracy from behind bars through intermediaries. "She's still trying to hurt children," Sophie said. with the flat certainty of someone who'd learned that evil doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Even locked up, she's still trying to finish what she started. The realization struck them all simultaneously. Victoria's network was larger and more persistent than anyone had imagined. Arresting the principal players hadn't dismantled the infrastructure they'd created over 15 years. Other pharmaceutical executives, medical professionals, and distribution networks remained in place, either unaware of their participation in murder or actively committed to continuing the systematic elimination of military families. Carlos Martinez's death wasn't a tragic aftermath of past crimes. It was evidence that the killing continued. Dr. Rodriguez's pager erupted with urgent beeps, followed immediately by her cell phone ringing with the distinctive tone reserved for medical emergencies. As she answered, her face grew increasingly pale with each word from the caller. 3 more children, she whispered after ending the call. Tucson, Phoenix, and Flagstaff. All former recipients of Sterling insulin, all presenting with severe metabolic crises despite being switched to clean medications. The contamination damaged their pancreatic function permanently. Rex moved away from the window and positioned himself protectively beside Sophie, his amber eyes scanning the hospital corridors with renewed vigilance. His military training recognized what the humans were slowly accepting. They were still under attack. The enemy had simply changed tactics from active poisoning to passive observation of their previous damage. "We need to get Sophie out of here," Maggie said suddenly, her nursing instincts screaming warnings about hospital security and potential threats. If they're tracking which children survived the contamination, this is exactly where they'd expect to find her. But Sophie shook her head with surprising firmness. "No, Mama Maggie. Running away doesn't help the other kids. Mrs. Sterling hurt lots of families because people didn't know to look for her. If we hide, she wins even from jail." The wisdom in her daughter's words struck Maggie like lightning illuminating a dark landscape. Victoria Sterling's greatest weapon hadn't been the contaminated insulin. It had been the silence and isolation that allowed her conspiracy to operate undetected for 15 years. Fear would only perpetuate that silence. "What are you thinking, sweetheart? Rex knows how to find bad people. He found Mrs. Sterling when the grown-ups couldn't see her. Maybe he can help find the other bad people, too." Dr. Rodriguez looked between them with growing understanding. "You're talking about using Rex to identify other members of the network, using his training to detect threats that conventional investigation might miss." "It's not safe," Maggie protested, even as part of her recognized the logic in Sophie's suggestion. "You're 7 years old and these people have already murdered 14 children. I won't put you in danger to catch criminals." "I'm already in danger," Sophie replied with devastating clarity. "All the kids are in danger as long as Mrs. Sterling's friends are still out there. At least this way, Rex can protect us while we help protect everyone else." The moral complexity of the situation settled over them like fog. Using a child as bait, even a protected child with a trained military dog, violated every instinct Maggie possessed about parental responsibility. But allowing Victoria's network to continue operating while more children died violated equally fundamental principles about community protection and justice. Rex solved the dilemma by making his own decision. The German Shepherd moved to Sophie's side and sat at attention, his posture clearly indicating readiness for duty. His amber eyes met Maggie's with calm intelligence that seemed to communicate understanding of both the risks and the necessity of what they were contemplating. "He's not just a pet anymore," Dr. Rodriguez observed quietly. "He's a working dog who's found his mission again. And Sophie's not just a victim, she's a survivor who understands that healing sometimes requires courage." Down the hall, Maria Martinez looked up from her vigil beside her son's body, her tear-stained face reflecting the grief that would soon touch other families if the conspiracy continued unchecked. Her eyes met Maggie's across the distance, and in that moment, both mothers understood the terrible mathematics of their situation. More children would die unless someone was willing to take extraordinary risks to stop the killing. "Mama, Maggie," Sophie said softly, her small hand slipping into Maggie's with the trust that had sustained them through months of medical mysteries and mounting danger. "Sometimes being brave means being scared but doing the right thing anyway. Rex taught me that." Outside, dawn was breaking over the desert, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that promised another day of scorching heat and infinite possibility. Carlos Martinez would never see another sunrise, but his death might serve as the catalyst that prevented other children from sharing his fate. As they walked through the hospital corridors toward an uncertain future, Rex maintained his protective position beside Sophie, while Maggie grappled with the realization that their quiet life of recovery and healing was about to transform into something far more dangerous and infinitely more important than she'd ever imagined. The reversal came at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday, delivered through a phone call that shattered everything Maggie thought she understood about truth, justice, and the nature of evil itself. Federal Agent Sarah Chen's voice carried the weight of revelations that would rewrite the story they'd been living for the past month. "Mrs. Thompson, I need you to sit down. What I'm about to tell you changes everything we thought we knew about Victoria Sterling and her conspiracy." Maggie gripped the phone with hands that had begun trembling before Agent Chen finished her first sentence. Beside her, Sophie stirred in her sleep, Rex immediately alert at the foot of the bed, sensing disturbance in the emotional atmosphere that had become his constant radar. "Victoria Sterling didn't kill your son," Agent Chen continued, her words falling like stones into still water. "She didn't poison Sophie's adoptive parents. She didn't mastermind a 15-year conspiracy to murder military children." The silence that followed felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down into an abyss that redefined the meaning of falling. "I don't understand," Maggie whispered. "She confessed. We heard her confess. She confessed to crimes she didn't commit because she believed she was protecting someone else. The real killer has been manipulating this entire situation, including Victoria's arrest, to eliminate the last witnesses to their operation." Rex rose from his position and moved to the window, his body language shifting into high alert as headlights swept across the desert road leading to their house. The German shepherd's low growl carried a warning that made Sophie's eyes snap open with the instant alertness of a child who'd learned to sleep with one ear tuned to danger. "Mama, Maggie, someone's coming," Sophie said, her voice clear despite having just awakened. "Rex says it's bad people." Agent Chen's voice crackled through the phone with increasing urgency. "Mrs. Thompson, are you still there? You need to listen carefully. The real conspirator is someone you trust, someone who's been close to this investigation from the beginning, someone who had access to all our evidence and has been using it to eliminate loose ends." Through the window, Maggie could see 3 vehicles approaching their house with the deliberate pace of people who didn't expect resistance. The lead car bore the familiar markings of the county sheriff's department, which should have been reassuring but instead filled her with terror as the pieces of Agent Chen's revelation began clicking into place. "Sheriff Martinez," Maggie breathed into the phone. "Oh my God, it's Sheriff Martinez." "Robert Martinez has been running the pharmaceutical conspiracy for 23 years, Agent Chen confirmed. "He recruited Victoria Sterling after her son's death, convinced her that she was helping him catch the real killers. Every piece of evidence she believed proved her guilt was actually manufactured by Martinez to make her the perfect scapegoat." The cars had stopped in their driveway, doors opening to reveal figures in tactical gear that looked official but moved with the purposeful coordination of people conducting an execution rather than an arrest. Sheriff Martinez stepped out of the lead vehicle, his familiar face barely visible in the pre-dawn darkness. but his posture radiating the confidence of someone who believed he held all the cards. "Why?" Maggie asked, though she was already moving, gathering Sophie's emergency medications and Rex's service vest while trying to process information that rewrote everything she'd believed about their community's protector. Money, initially. Martinez discovered he could supplement his sheriff's salary by facilitating drug distribution through official channels. But when military investigators started getting close 15 years ago, he realized he could eliminate potential witnesses while building a profitable business selling contaminated insulin to insurance companies at premium prices. Sophie was fully awake now, moving with the efficient calm of a child who'd learned that survival sometimes depended on quick action and quiet compliance. She grabbed her sketchbook and stuffed dog while Rex positioned himself between the family and the approaching threat, his military training overriding his domestic comfort. The children who died, Agent Chen continued, weren't targeted because of their parents' military service. They were targeted because Martinez needed a steady supply of dead children to justify his department's expanded medical examiner budget and pharmaceutical contracts. He was literally profiting from murder. A knock at the front door interrupted the call, Sheriff Martinez's voice carrying the false warmth that had fooled an entire community for over 2 decades. "Maggie? Sophie? I know it's early, but we've had some developments in the Sterling case. We need to transport you both to a secure location immediately." "The back door," Maggie whispered to Sophie. "Take Rex and go to Dr. Crawford's house. Stay off the roads." But Sophie shook her head with the stubborn courage that had sustained her through months of poisoning and terror. "Rex won't leave you, and I won't leave Rex. We stay together, or the bad people win again." Agent Chen's voice carried new urgency through the phone. "Mrs. Thompson, Martinez doesn't know we've uncovered his operation. Federal agents are en route, but they're 20 minutes away. You need to buy time without letting him know that you know." "Maggie?" Sheriff Martinez called again, his tone shifting slightly toward impatience. "I can see your lights are on. This is important." Taking a deep breath that felt like preparing for surgery without anesthesia, Maggie opened the front door with what she hoped was a convincing expression of confused cooperation. "Sheriff Martinez, what's wrong? Has something happened?" Martinez smiled with the practiced sincerity that had won him 6 consecutive elections, but his eyes held a flatness that Maggie now recognized as predatory calculation. "I'm afraid we've discovered that Victoria Sterling wasn't working alone. We have reason to believe that other members of her network are planning to eliminate witnesses, including you and Sophie." Behind him, 4 deputies stood at positions that looked protective but would effectively prevent escape. Maggie recognized 2 of them as men who'd been present at every major development in their case, who'd had access to every piece of evidence and every conversation about their investigation. "Of course," Maggie replied, fighting to keep her voice steady. "Let me just get Sophie ready. She's been having a difficult time sleeping since everything happened." "Actually," Martinez said, stepping into the house with the casual authority of someone who'd never been refused entry, "time is critical. We can provide clothes and necessities at the safe house. We need to move immediately." Rex's growl started low and built to a rumble that vibrated through the floorboards, his amber eyes fixed on Martinez with unmistakable recognition of threat. The sheriff's hand moved unconsciously toward his service weapon, a gesture that confirmed every terrible suspicion Agent Chen had planted. "That dog seems agitated," Martinez observed, his tone carrying a suggestion that had nothing to do with Sophie's safety. "Perhaps we should arrange for separate transport. There are facilities designed for handling traumatized animals." "Rex stays with me," Sophie said clearly, appearing in the hallway with her backpack and Rex's leash. "He's my service dog. The law says he stays with me." Martinez's mask slipped just enough for Maggie to see the calculation behind his concerned expression. He was weighing risks and benefits, determining whether eliminating witnesses was worth the complications of killing a federal agent's ongoing investigation. "Of course, sweetheart," he said finally. "We want you to feel safe, but you understand that everyone's safety is my primary concern." The implied threat hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. Martinez was communicating his willingness to harm Sophie if necessary while maintaining plausible deniability about his intentions. This was a man who'd perfected the art of appearing helpful while orchestrating murder. Agent Chen's voice whispered through Maggie's phone, which she'd tucked into her jacket pocket. "Keep him talking. Federal backup is 12 minutes out." "Sheriff, I'm curious about something," Maggie said, settling into a chair with the deliberate movements of someone buying time. "How did you first suspect that Victoria wasn't working alone?" Martinez's smile grew more genuine, the expression of someone who enjoyed explaining his cleverness. "Police work is about patterns, Maggie. Victoria was too sloppy, too emotional. The real mastermind behind this operation would be more systematic, more careful about covering tracks." "Someone with access to official channels," Maggie suggested. "Someone who could manipulate evidence and control narratives." "Exactly. Someone who understood how investigations work, how to direct attention away from the real crimes while building cases against convenient scapegoats." Rex had positioned himself between Martinez and Sophie, his body language screaming warnings that the adults were trying to ignore for the sake of a conversation that might keep them alive long enough for rescue to arrive. "Someone like you," Sophie said quietly, her 7-year-old voice cutting through the adult pretense with a devastating clarity. "Rex knows you're the one who hurt the children. He's been trying to tell us, but we didn't understand." Martinez's hand moved fully to his weapon now, his facade crumbling like a dam that had finally sustained too much pressure. Smart little girl, too smart for her own good. 6 months later, the morning sun painted golden rectangles across the hardwood floors of what had once been Maggie's too-quiet house and had transformed into something that hummed with the comfortable chaos of a family learning to be whole again. Sophie sat at the kitchen table, carefully measuring insulin with the precision of someone who understood that mathematics could mean the difference between life and death, but without the fear that had once accompanied every medical ritual. Rex lay beside her chair, no longer the hyper-vigilant guardian scanning for threats, but still attentive in the way of a soldier who'd found peace without forgetting his training. His amber eyes tracked Sophie's movements with gentle interest rather than desperate protection, though his head still lifted whenever strangers approached their property. "Mama Maggie," Sophie said, using the title that had evolved from necessity into chosen affection. "Dr. Rodriguez says my pancreas is getting stronger. The new insulin is helping my body remember how to work right." Maggie looked up from the morning newspaper, which featured yet another article about the pharmaceutical corruption trial that had captivated national attention for months. Sheriff Martinez faced federal charges that would likely keep him imprisoned for the remainder of his life, while Victoria Sterling had been quietly released after investigators confirmed her innocence in the actual murders, though her confession to crimes she hadn't committed had complicated her own legal situation. "Your body is healing, sweetheart, just like your heart," Maggie replied, folding the newspaper to hide headlines that still had the power to disturb their carefully reconstructed peace. "Dr. Crawford says Rex is healing, too. His nightmares have stopped, and he started playing with the therapy dogs at the Veterans Center." The kitchen walls displayed Sophie's latest artwork. Drawings that showed families of various configurations, dogs with realistic rather than angelic proportions, and houses surrounded by flowers that looked welcoming rather than threatening. The progression from her earlier sketches told the story of trauma gradually replaced by security, fear transformed into hope. A knock at the front door made Rex's ears prick forward with interest rather than alarm. Through the window, they could see Dr. Crawford's truck in the driveway, along with a smaller vehicle that belonged to Maria Martinez, whose friendship with Maggie had deepened through shared grief and mutual support. "The support group meeting isn't until this afternoon," Maggie said, puzzled by the unexpected visit. Sophie grinned with the expression of someone keeping a secret that would bring joy rather than harm. "I asked them to come early. Today's special." Before Maggie could ask for clarification, their visitors had let themselves in with the easy familiarity of extended family. Dr. Crawford carried a manila folder thick with official documents, while Maria Martinez held a bakery box that smelled of chocolate and celebration. "Margaret Thompson," Dr. Crawford announced with ceremonial gravity. "The Department of Veterans Affairs has officially recognized Rex as a Purple Heart recipient, the first canine to receive the honor posthumously granted to his handler, Sergeant Thomas Thompson." Rex's tail began wagging with the enthusiasm of a dog who sensed good news even if he didn't understand the specifics. Sophie clapped her hands with delight, and Maggie felt tears gathering in her eyes as the meaning of the recognition settled over her like a blessing. Their family, unconventional, forged by tragedy but stronger for having survived it together, had finally found the peace that had seemed impossible just 6 months earlier, when darkness had masqueraded as light and danger had worn the face of protection. Sometimes the greatest victories come disguised as the smallest gestures. In a world that often feels divided and uncertain, Maggie and Sophie's story reminds us that families aren't always born. Sometimes they're chosen, forged in moments when courage matters more than comfort. At 72, Maggie discovered that starting over isn't about age, it's about heart. She found purpose in raising Sophie, strength in trusting Rex, and proof that wisdom gained through loss can become the foundation for unexpected joy. For those of us who've buried dreams, raised grandchildren, or wondered if our contributions still matter, their journey offers profound hope. Rex taught them that loyalty transcends species, that healing requires patience, and that sometimes the most broken among us possess the greatest capacity for love. Sophie showed them that children's resilience can inspire adult courage, that truth spoken simply carries more power than elaborate deceptions. Their unconventional family, a widow, an orphaned child, and a traumatized dog, created something beautiful from pieces others might have discarded. In our season of life, when society often suggests our stories are ending, Maggie's experience proves our most meaningful chapters might just be beginning. What unexpected blessing has taught you that family comes in forms you never anticipated? Have you discovered purpose or joy in circumstances that initially seemed like endings rather than beginnings?